All right, good morning or good afternoon. I just want to say thank you for being such great students while I've been out the last week and a half. I do plan to return back to school on either Wednesday or Thursday. When I return back to school, I'll grade all of your assignments in the quiz, get everything in the grade book, everything back to normal. I want to again thank you for bearing with me during the last week and a half. I know that last week could have went better. I was feeling pretty sick last week, and I think I'm finally on that uphill swing. So, I know I will for sure not see any Austin students face to face anymore because we will be going distance learning after Thanksgiving. So, Wednesday is kind of that time where we can meet. I'll just send out one link. You can join if you need to talk to me about anything. I know that today we will start our baby book and it could be confusing to some. So I just wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity where there wasn't necessarily content learning, but just a time for us to meet either one-on-one or as a class. Again, I'll set up a link. It will be available on Wednesday. I think I'm going to have it starting at 10 o'clock. So 10 o'clock, there will be a link on Wednesday. Anybody can join that, but I will see my Packer crew in person either Thursday or Friday. Again, I just wanted to take a day where there was no content learning, just a collaboration, so I can figure out what are you struggling with, what do we need to do to help you for distance learning, etc. So 10 o'clock Wednesday, I will send out the link. We have talked in the past about infertility, infant loss, birth defects, different ways to get pregnant, and family planning. And these are all leading up to pregnancy. So we will start with trimester 1 this week. And pregnancy, there are 9 months, and then those months are broken down into trimesters. So we have trimester 1, 2, and 3, and all trimesters are 3 months long. So we have months 1 through 3 in trimester 1, 4, 5, 6 in trimester 2, and in trimester 3 we have 6, 7, 8, and 9. Sorry. We will be using scientific names in some aspects, like the germinal stage, the embryonic stage, and finally the fetal stage. And the germinal and embryonic stage are very rapid. It's actually within the first 8 weeks of pregnancy, a female will go through both of those stages and then end the fetal stage on week 8 through the rest of pregnancy. So trimester 1, we're looking at weeks 1 through 12. When we talk about pregnancy, you might often hear the process called conception. So this process, once every 28 days, a woman will release an ovum from one of her ovaries. That process is also known as ovulation. An ovum is a female egg cell. And then during this time, a woman's body will release a hormone to prepare the uterus in case the ovum is fertilized. So our uterus is an organ in a woman's body in which the baby develops during pregnancy. I would highly suggest all of these terms that are highlighted and underlined that you write down in a notebook so you can use this in the future. The fallopian tube, that is a tube that connects the ovary to the uterus. So during ovulation, the inner lining of a woman's uterus will actually grow and thicken. And then that ovum If it is not fertilized, that lining will then shed. So the walls, that lining will shed and pass out of the body. That's known as a woman's menstruation cycle. Again, we have an ovum, which is the female egg. If it is not fertilized by sperm, the lining breaks down and passes out of the female's body. That is the menstruation cycle. Where are we at? Sperm, that is the male cell. And then conception is that process of sperm and ovum meeting, or that sperm fertilizing the ovum. So when a sperm reaches the fallopian tubes, it can penetrate and fertilize the ovum. I want you to remember and think back to week 1. When a male ejaculates inside of a female, he releases roughly 1 million sperm that enter into the woman. And then of those, you lose some in the vagina, some in the cervix, all through their journey of trying to make it to that ovum. Roughly, there's only about 200 to 300 sperm that end up making it into the fallopian tubes. And then out of those sperm, they all have to fight, and only one will actually fertilize the ovum. Okay, I want you to look at this picture, but we will come right back to it. So conception continued. An ovum lives for 12 to 24 hours. So usually about half a day to a day. But sperm lives 2 to 3 days. Again, pregnancy, I think we all know it's a 9-month process, and it begins after sperm has entered into the ovum. Then single cell growth happens and develops into a human. An ectopic pregnancy is when the baby begins to grow somewhere other than the uterus. So I have an example, fallopian tubes. If I go back to this image, on the left-hand side here, we can see that this says normal pregnancy. We can see the vagina, the cervix, we can see our fallopian tubes, the uterus, and then we see embryo implanted normally. So that embryo, that ovum and sperm met correctly, and that baby is now being developed inside the uterus. That's the uterine lining right there. If we look on this image at the right, this is an ectopic pregnancy. So here we can see all of these white circles are representing that embryo. We can see that the embryo is in the cervix. It's floating. It might be in the fallopian tubes or in the ovaries. So that's called an ectopic pregnancy because it occurs outside of the uterus. Getting into genetics. Again, please, please, please write down these key terms. You can use them on quizzes. So just some terms. A gene is a unit that determines a human's inherited characteristics. A chromosome, that is a tiny thread-like structure in the nucleus of every cell. And during conception, every human will get 46 chromosomes. We get 23 from our father, and we get 23 chromosomes from our mother. So chromosomes come in pairs, and that's the sperm and ovum that both contribute to this factor. So the sperm will contribute 1 chromosome, and the ovum contributes 1 chromosome to each pair. And then in these chromosomes, there are genes, and genes are the units that determine a human's inherited characteristics. DNA, that's our makeup of our human body. That's the 46 chromosomes. No 2 people are the same except for identical twins. All right. So, talking about genes, we always wonder, why do I have brown hair? Why do I have brown eyes? Why am I short? Why am I tall? Etc. This occurs in that gene process. So we have dominant, which are the stronger genes, and we have recessive genes, and those tend to be the weaker genes. So how do they work? How do genes work? You get one copy from your mother and one copy from your father. If both of those genes are the same, the child will automatically have those characteristics. If it's different, the characteristic is controlled by the dominant gene. So, if I look at myself and Colby, for example, I have blonde hair and Colby has blonde hair. So more than likely our child will have blonde hair. Now, if I had brown hair, but Colby had blonde hair, we would have to look at the past generations. So if Colby's parents both have brown hair and my family has brown hair, then it's more likely that if we were to have a child, that child would have brown hair. But some traits may skip a generation, and this could be when the recessive gene is inherited. So for those that have red hair, that might skip a generation and then occur. So if you know that red hair is in your family, if your grandma has red hair, it might have skipped your mom and then you have it. Or if you don't have it, but your mom does or your father does, it might have skipped you and then your child might end up with red hair someday. All right. Oops. I want you to watch this video on your own. It's talking about that dominant versus recessive gene a little bit more in depth. So gender. I am going to read a section from the book, but I also broke it down in this slide. The gender of a child is determined at conception. Remember, conception's when that sperm fertilizes the ovum. The sex chromosomes come in two types, X and Y. Each ovum in the woman's ovaries carries an X chromosome. So if we look at this cheat sheet, we can see that there are sex chromosomes. There are two, either have an X or a Y. If we look further down, we can see that each ovum will always be an X. So if you are a female, you only carry an X chromosome. Each sperm cell in the man's body carries either an X or a Y chromosome. So if you are a male, in your sperm, you will either have an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. If the sperm that fertilized the egg carries an X chromosome, the child then receives an X chromosome from the mother and an X chromosome from the father. A child with a combination XX is a girl. If the sperm carries a Y chromosome, the child receives an X chromosome from the mother and a Y from the father. A child with an XY combination is a boy. Oh, you might not be able to see that down here during this presentation, sorry. But we have an ovum with an X, a sperm will have an X or a Y, a girl will always be two X's, and a boy will always be that XY. Looking into multiple births. All right, multiple birth is when a woman gives birth to more than one child at a time. The most common that we hear of are twins. There are two types of twins, fraternal twins and identical twins. And I just want to point out that births of 3+ babies is rare. So twins. Again, write this down. Identical twins. This is when that sperm fertilizes a woman's ovum and the cell begins to divide right away. So there's a mass of cells and then they split in half and create two separate cell masses. That would be two different embryos. And then they continue to divide and grow into those separate embryos. So this is one ovum and one sperm that are involved in conception. And then identical twins have similar characteristics and they're typically always the same gender. So identical twins, same gender. If we look in this photo of these two girls, sometimes it's hard to tell them apart, especially when they're younger. Fraternal twins. These are my relatives. They just started kindergarten this year. So this is when two eggs are released from the ovaries at the same time, and they're fertilized by two different sperm. So identical twins, one ovum, one sperm. Fraternal twins, two different ovum and two different sperm. They might not look alike, and it's common for fraternal twins to be opposite genders. Three in 100 births are twins. Identical twins are less common than fraternal. And in 1,000 births, 23 will be fraternal twins. So the germinal stage of pregnancy. This is the first stage of baby's development. The germinal stage only lasts 2 weeks. Again, write this down. The germinal stage is that first stage of baby's development, and it usually lasts 2 weeks. This is when the formation of the zygote happens. A zygote is a fertilized egg. So the germinal stage, cell division. A zygote grows by cell division while in the fallopian tubes. So if you look in this image down to the side, you can see the ovum labeled as red and the sperm as blue. So if you look in that photo of the zygote, that's when that sperm and ovum are splitting. So it's a single cell that splits into two. Then they multiply really fast. So 4, 8, 16, etc. And then within a few days, that zygote has grown 500 living cells. After 4 days of growth, that is when the zygote reaches the opening to the uterus. So we're in that germinal stage. We're starting pregnancy, looking at implantation. The uterine lining thickens. We talked about that earlier. So the zygote can attach and keep growing. So, like I said earlier, the uterine lining thickens, and if there is no sperm that has entered into an ovum, it just sheds, and that's the woman's menstruation cycle. But if a sperm and an ovum come together and it is fertilized, that uterine lining is thickened so the zygote can attach to that lining and keep growing. So the zygote implants itself into the lining of the uterus, or the uterine lining. Then that lining will actually cover up that zygote, and that's what will protect it. During the 2 weeks after fertilization, that zygote is only the size of the head of a pin. So it's super, super, super tiny. And now it's ready to grow into a human. All right, week 1 and 2 of pregnancy. The zygote is formed and attached itself to the uterine lining. So if we look at this, this is the female reproductive system. right here, this is now a zygote, and it is attached to this lining right here. The lining has enclosed over the zygote, excuse me, and pregnancy has now been achieved. But in weeks 1 and 2, it's too early to tell with a pregnancy test. So within weeks 1 and 2, it's the germinal stage of pregnancy. A sperm has met with an ovum, fertilized. We now call that a zygote, and it has formed and attached itself to a woman's uterine lining. That lining is then enclosed over the zygote, and pregnancy has been achieved. So the embryonic stage is the second stage of pregnancy. So the first 2 weeks we call a baby a zygote. Then starting in week 3, that is now a developing baby, and we call it an embryo. An embryo is that developing baby from the 3rd week of pregnancy through the 8th week of pregnancy. So we have zygote the first 2 weeks, embryo from the 3rd week through the 8th week. This grows rapidly. There are many important changes that occur. The face, eyes, ears, limbs, and bones all begin to start forming in the 3rd week of pregnancy. The embryonic stage, talking about organs and body systems. So our cells then start to separate to develop into those major organs. We'll see the heart, lungs, bones, and muscles. This is the beginning of those organs being created, but they cannot function yet. So within the 3rd week, they all start to develop, but the heart isn't pumping yet. The lungs aren't going. They're just starting to grow and develop. So this occurs 20 days after conception, then that neural tube will close. The neural tube will become the baby's brain and spinal cord. Continued on, the brain begins to start to take control of different body systems. The 6th week after conception is when connections between that brain and spine allow the first movements of an embryo. So remember, it's still called an embryo between weeks 3 and 8. This is when, in the 6th week, is when movements start to occur. The developing brain is sensitive to damage from any drugs or alcohol the mother might intake. Remember, this is when birth defects can occur throughout the whole pregnancy, but during week 3, that's when that baby starts to, if we go back, that's when the baby begins to have those major organs like their heart, lungs, bones, and muscles. So it's very important to avoid those substances. That's when birth defects occur. The embryonic stage continued, the amniotic sac. That's a sac filled with liquids that forms around the embryo. So amniotic fluid, that's the liquid that surrounds and protects the developing baby in the uterus. It is formed from special layers of cells within the uterus, and the whole purpose of this is to help protect that embryo if the mother bumps into something or falls. The embryo is about 2.5 centimeters to 1 inch long. Excuse me. And the embryo does start to begin to float freely in that fluid. So the embryonic stage, placenta. The placenta is a tissue that connects the developing baby to the uterus. There again are special layers of cells. It's very, very rich in blood vessels that allows that food and oxygen to flow to the baby. And then the job of the placenta is to absorb oxygen and nutrition from the mother's blood, and that gets sent to the baby through the umbilical cord. So talking last week about the different nutrition for a mother, this is why it's important to not eat flaming hot Cheetos. There's no nutritional value in those flaming hot Cheetos to give to your developing baby. So the baby will actually pull those nutrients from the mother's blood It will get sent to the baby through that umbilical cord. The umbilical cord, that's the long tube that connects the baby to the placenta. CO2 and other waste products will get pulled away from the baby and actually will go through that. So waste products will go into the placenta, then it reaches the mother's bloodstream, and that's when all of those bad products, so to speak, go away. When we think of the umbilical cord, I want you to think of a hose that's filled with water. It's pretty hard to bend that hose when it's filled with water. It's stiff and firm. It's not very flexible. However, we do hear sometimes that the umbilical cord has wrapped around a baby's neck, causing that baby to die inside of the mother. But that is very rare. So umbilical cord and placenta, they provide everything that a baby needs until birth. If we look, we can see that this is the umbilical cord. We can see blood vessels within there. And then this section is the placenta. We're growing in a uterus. And this blue water liquid, that is the amniotic fluid. So week 3, the zygote has attached to the uterine lining. The body releases HCG, and the levels release slowly at first. And then they continue to double every 2 to 3 days. It will still be a week before those levels are high enough to be detected by an at-home pregnancy test. 1 in 3 women might experience implantation bleeding, and this is when the zygote attaches to the uterine lining that causes a light bleeding to occur. So some people might actually think that they are having an early period, but it's just that implantation bleeding. That's when that zygote has reached the uterine lining. It's starting to cover that lining, starting to cover over the zygote to protect it, but it might cause a female to bleed a little bit, and that's one of the earliest signs of pregnancy. Week 4, the baby's tissues and organs are beginning to develop. It looks kind of like a 3-layered disc, and then within those next couple of days, that disc will actually branch out and start to form bones, skin, muscles, and other organs. A pregnancy test might read a positive sign this week, but it's usually between weeks 4 and 6. So we can start testing for pregnancy in week 4, 5, and 6. It just depends on that HCG hormone and if it is strong enough. All right, that is my last slide for today. I would like you to hop over to Schoology and look at the video for your baby book presentation project.